We have a pretty amazing church, I think. And as we celebrate these 10 years, I believe God is doing something profound. We're looking at a lot of the memories, the things that we remember about our church over the past 10 years. And I was a youth pastor for 23 years. And so there's a lot of youth pastor stuff still stuck in me, like good old throwing Oreos at people who know answers to trivia questions. Oh yeah, so church today is about answering all the right questions. You got it? And the answer isn't always Jesus, okay? The answer is often like a number. Like, for example, how many locations has our church been in the past 10 years? No. 5 is the answer. John, I'm going to throw these now. I will not promise any accuracy on all my throws. However, I just think it's fun to celebrate a little bit. Let's see. I have so many questions to ask all of you. Do you know where our church got started? Washington. Not in Washington. In Loveland, what? Loveland, like at the Crossroads in Loveland. Can you catch? Very nice. All right. Very cool. Hey, who were some of our very first members? If you were part of the actual early Constitution signing the original, look at the hands. That's just awesome. Would you just stand up for a second? And we just want to thank you for helping get our church started. Go ahead. You can stand up. That's right. Bob and Marilyn Smith. That's right. And the Wells are upstairs. That's right. Just think about that. We wouldn't be here if you hadn't started what you started. I think that's an awesome thing. Well, I figured instead of just talking about our 10 years, I would go back a few thousand years and talk about originally this whole idea of remembering, okay? We're going to look at the book of Joshua, chapter 4. And if I had time this morning, I would read to you Joshua chapter 1 and chapter 2 and chapter 3, but they go a little something like this. Moses, who had led all the people out of Egypt and out of slavery, had died. In fact, Joshua chapter 1 starts with, okay, Joshua, Moses is dead. It's a great opening to a book. Like if you ever want to read a book, the best part is the previous guy died. It's a great way to start a book. And Joshua then is called to lead the nation of Israel. And as you read the book of Joshua, it's all about conquest. It's all about conquering. I mean, the whole first chapter is like, get yourself ready because we're going to cross over this river. And we're going to take over the land of Canaan. We're going to take over all these people. And the entire book of Joshua is about conquest. It's very American, if you will. We're all about conquest. We're all about consumerism and capitalism and achieving more and getting better and becoming more and becoming, right? More healthy. The more stuff I read online is all about the 10 best foods to eat to lose belly fat. And this is the best way to exercise. And these are the best ways to sleep at night. And this is the best way to lose anxiety. And it's all about this self-help stuff. And as we read the book of Joshua, it's like this whole tribe of 2 million people learning how to just march along and do their thing amazingly. And God's just going to conquer the world through them, right? You know the best part about Joshua is in chapter 3, there's this entire timeout. God's like, okay, I know you want to conquer the world. Like I know that you're a brand new nation and we're going to conquer the world. But God's like, why don't we slow down and actually recognize that God is at work? And we'll thank God first for his work, and then God will allow us to move forward. And I think that's a great concept for us as a church. We've been 10 years as a church, and we want to launch forward and do more things in the next 10 years. But before we just conquer the world, I think God wants us to just stop and take a time out and thank him. So if you turn to Joshua chapter 4, I want you to see this concept of these Israelites who crossed this Jordan River. They crossed at this point above the Dead Sea. Where this arrow is, the town of Jericho is where they're headed, but they can't get there because this river that is in front of them, the Jordan River, is at flood stage, which means its banks are overflowing, and there's no way around this river. I mean, they've been wandering for 40 years in this desert, and then they need to get just to that point across the river, and God's like, well, you're not going to go south of the Dead Sea. That would take more years. You're not going to go north. We're going to just cross over. And God does this incredible miracle with them and tells them in chapter 3, I'm going to stop up the river. I'm going to pile up the water, and you're going to cross over on dry ground. And in chapter 3, Joshua then, and this is what the river Jordan looks like today. And but in chapter 3, it says the banks were overflowing because it was at flood stage. The banks of the river were flooding. And I don't know if you've ever tried to cross a river. How many of you have been river rafting before? Like you go with, there's a Noah's Ark group down in Buena Vista. There's some other places you can go river rafting. And the guide always tells you, be careful. If you fall out of the raft, make sure you grab your life jacket and you float with your feet downward so that if you hit rocks, you can brace yourself with your feet. You know all this stuff? And you know that water is so rapid that it can just wipe you out. So God says, I'm going to stop up the river and you're going to walk across on dry ground. He did this already for the Israelites at the Red Sea when they came out of Egypt. So follow with me in Joshua chapter 4. When the whole nation had finished crossing the Jordan, the Lord said to Joshua, choose 12 men from among the people, one from each tribe, and tell them to take up 12 stones from the middle of the Jordan, right where the priests were standing, to carry them over with you and put them down at the place where you stay tonight. Here's the deal. The Ark of the Covenant of God was being ushered across the river by the priests. And as the Ark of the Covenant went across, that's the presence of God in a box. People say that we in church gather in a box. It's kind of ironic, but the presence of God used to gather in a box. It's funny that we're like God's presence today in a building. And this Ark of the Covenant was carried across the river, and the whole river stopped up. And then Joshua called together these people to take 12 big boulders out of the middle of the river. Look at verse 4. So Joshua called together the 12 men he had appointed from the Israelites, one from each tribe, and he said to them, go over before the ark of the Lord your God in the middle of the Jordan. Each of you is to take up a stone on his shoulder according to the number of the tribes of Israelites to serve as a sign among you. In verse 6, in the future, when your children ask you, hey, what do those rocks mean? What is that stack of rocks for? Tell them that the flow of the Jordan was cut off before the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord. When it crossed the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan were cut off. These stones are to be a memorial to the people of Israel forever. I love that. And then we'll jump all the way to verse 22 at the end of the chapter. Verse 22 reads like this. In 21, what do these stones mean? Tell them Israel crossed the Jordan on dry ground. For the Lord your God dried up the Jordan before you until you had crossed over. The Lord your God did to the Jordan what he had done to the Red Sea when he dried it up before us until we had crossed over. So 2 times God did this incredible river miracle. He did this so that all the peoples of the earth might know that the hand of the Lord is powerful, and so that you might always fear the Lord your God. Do you know why God does miracles in your life? I mean, do you know why? Is it just for your good? And just for your health? And just for your benefit? And just for your comfort? And your ease? And your financial peace? No. God does miracles in your life so that he gets all the glory. God is a God who is willing to let you walk through what you walk through and help you come out the other side of a miracle so that you might look back and remember, oh yeah, that's where God worked in my life. So today we're going to look at this whole idea of why we remember things, like why we remember the presence of God in our church, and how do we do that? I'm going to take you through 12 simple marks of our church, and we're going to stack these stones, if you will, and remember 12 things. I'm going to throw out a little trivia to you here and there. Gail got to answer the first question is, how did Crossroads get started? This is the history of the church, if you will. Number one is really that it was a dream of Crossroads Church in Loveland. There were a lot of people coming from Greeley to the Loveland Crossroads Church, commuting every Sunday to go out there. And the Loveland Crossroads Church said, well, let's plant a group of people in Greeley. Let's start a church. And originally it was going to be what? A satellite church, yes. It was a dream of Loveland, and it was going to be a satellite church. They were going to plant at a building. They were going to have the sermons projected in, and a lot of churches do this, and it's fine, and just things didn't work out financially. It wasn't able to work, and so what happened was, the second thing that happened was a faithful group of people gathered in a garage, is what I've heard. Number 3 is, before we hit the slide, where is the first building you all gathered in? Any hands? Yes. Not St. Michael's, I'm sorry. Momford Elementary. Dave, I don't know if I can get this back there. Oh, totally bad throw. That's why I didn't play baseball in high school. Momford Elementary School on, 47th Ave? Over on 20th Street. They were at Momford. You were there for a long time, right? About a year probably. And somebody recently told me that, maybe the Wells told me that there was a sign spinner that was outside on the street spinning a Crossroads church sign, like a real estate person, and that drew people to come to Momford Elementary for their church. And then they started growing, and so where's the second place? Northridge High School, that's right. I'll throw you some cookies over there. Northridge High School. So they were at Northridge High School. They met in the gymnasium, I think. They had all kinds of banners and signs and big light towers and big old music and just a whole lot of fun. And you know what happened? They grew exponentially. You grew to like 400 people within the first few years. It was so big, in fact, it kind of got a little top-heavy is what I heard. It got a little bit like, wow, we grew so fast, we don't have this great structure underneath us. And things happened, and the price went up in rent, and different things changed. So then where's the third place you all went? Do you know? Hey, St. Michael's. I know. Watch yourself. I hope you're wearing goggles today. In fact, if you could just sign a release form that you're not going to sue the church, just put that in the offering. That'd be nice. Yeah, St. Michael's Banquet Center. And that was in 2010. And then I hadn't been in any of these places yet, and then that's when I got called to be the pastor in 2011. I remember that whole situation. My family and I left a church in Seattle, and we went on a sabbatical that summer in 2011 to Panama. And this little church in Greeley, Colorado, Crossroads Church, meeting in the upstairs area of St. Michael's, gave me an email or a call and said, hey, we found your resume. Would you like to come out and interview? And we drove out. We had gone to Estes Park for something, and we got to see the building and came out and interviewed and just had a fantastic connection with everybody. And our church was how big at that time? 75 people, that's right. We were just down to 75 people, didn't have a pastor. We were trying to keep everything all together, and so I was able to come. Do you remember the 2 little rooms downstairs? There was this little ice cream shop that had left. It was like a Cold Stone ice cream, and they had moved out. We used that as our little Panera Bread, our little hospitality corner. And then the little corner on this side was an old pizza place, and we got to use that as the youth room and play area, and then we had kids' rooms and all kinds of things. And boy, has that ever changed since then, huh? Does anybody know why we had to leave St. Michael's? Does anybody know why we had to leave? Do you know why? Yes, some guy from Boulder came in, and overnight he climbed up the back side of the building and he went inside the little porch area, and the door was open to the real estate person's office, and he snuck in. And I don't know what he did inside the files and all that, but I got to church at 6 in the morning. These are the days when we used to set up the church and do everything. And this strange man was in there, and I go, hey, buddy, what are you doing here so early? And he goes, I came here to go to church. And I'm like, 6 in the morning? He's like, yeah. Turns out he was a guy that rode a bus up from Boulder, broke into the St. Michael's, rummaged through all kinds of real estate information, social security numbers and whatnot. So after church and during that week, I met with the owners of the building, and we met with all the people who were renting the different spaces. And it was like this terrible argument come across the table. People are fighting over, we need new locks on the doors, we need fingerprint passwords, we need codes, and we need video cameras and all this. And so the owner said, forget it, I'm going to sell the building. And I thought, wait, we have a church. We have about 200 people, and what are we going to go? So where did we go? The Carmike movie theater. Brenda, I heard you first. Yes, we moved to the Carmike movie theater. Isn't it beautiful? The Carmike was awesome. In fact, we got written up in the newspaper when we were at the Carmike. It says it's a beautiful building. Do you remember this? It was so cool. We met in this movie theater that was how old? 50 years old, 80 years old. I mean, all sticky floors, and like the chairs had gum in them, and it was all dark. And we had the hardest time because people didn't really like it. It was a little too dark. We lost a whole bunch of numbers of folks, and I loved it. I totally loved the lighting. I loved using the screen as our background, and the music was great, and we were able to use it. And then all of a sudden, in like 2014, they wanted to raise our rent every week from, I don't know what we were like $500 a week. It was $2,000 a month, and they wanted to raise it to $1,500 a week because the Carmike was going to be sold out and was going to be demolished because a guy from Texas bought it. And before they sold it, they were like, well, let's try to make our money back. So they ended up selling it, and we moved out, and we had to move to, or got to move to, right here. That's exactly. Ready? This is for you guys. We moved to the First Baptist Church in Greeley. I know. Isn't that cool? And so the way this all worked out, Char Wells and Dave told me that the superintendent of the American Baptist denomination happened to be in Greeley on this certain day and said, hey, would you meet with this person for coffee? And so we met together and had an hour-long talk about how our church is a lot like their church, and what are you going to do with your building? Because they had in this building, how old is this? 110 years old? And they had a pastor who had a congregation of about 10 or 11 people, and they were meeting every Sunday, but it wasn't enough to continue to sustain him as a pastor and them as a group. So I said, well, I'd be happy to, what are you going to do with the building? They said, well, we're going to close down in May of 2014. I said, well, then what? Like, just an empty building? And they said, yeah, we have a bunch of them all over the nation. Oh, it's so sad. I said, well, I could borrow your building for a while. I could dust off the pews. I can make sure the electricity still works. And he goes, yeah, let's do it. And we were able to connect and come in. We moved in that summer. I think it was July 1st of 2014. Do you remember we had church at the Carmike, and everybody with a pickup truck, we loaded everything we had, and we drove it all right over here, and we started setting up all this stuff. And we've been in here now for 4 years. It's been awesome. Yeah. It's cool. All right, let's talk a little bit more about more than just structure. Let's talk about people. Do you remember children's ministry all through these years of our Crossroads Church? We've had kids ministry that has ministered to so many kids and so many people. We've done VBSs here. We've done all kinds of things to celebrate, and we've done backpack things. We've done stuff that has really kind of celebrated children for years and years. Do you remember some of the children's ministers' names? Alf is not a children's minister. I'd like my cookies back. Thank you. What are some, Laura was one, exactly. Laura is now passing the torch to somebody else. Any other children's ministers you remember? Big, tall guy that played the bass? Brian Robinson, you remember him? And who was before Brian Robinson? Tiza, that's exactly. I had Trista, but it is Tiza. I met her just a couple months ago. Oh yeah, Dave, you want Alf's cookies or a different set? These are kind of broken. Oh my gosh, don't hold this against me. Kids ministry is amazing. It's totally fun. We're going to have a transition of a children's family minister coming up here in the next couple weeks. So on August 19th, we're going to celebrate. If you look in your bulletin, we're going to announce a new children's director, and so I want you to be aware of some things that are coming, and we're going to celebrate what God's doing in the next couple years. Let's talk about youth ministry, Larry. Who were some of the youth pastors we had? Oh, Matt DeSchmidt, very nice. Here, these are Alf's old cookies. You can have those. We had a guy named Bobby. Do you remember Bobby Brunswick? He used to take all of our youth in a car, and they'd go buy French fries at every one of the fast food places and compare French fries during the night. Daniel Stepp, that's exactly right. He moved to California after, a year he was with us. We had the Teals. Do you remember Darren and Kathy Teal? They took a bunch of our students to Chick, which is a youth conference every 3 years. And now we have Alf. We celebrate Alf every day. Let's talk about worship ministries for a minute. How many worship pastors have we had, or worship directors? Yeah, we had Eden. We've had Jonah. Remember Jonah? We had McKendra. We had Miranda. What? Patrick, yeah. He moved to Texas. We have Holly now. We celebrate Holly. So God just is working through our worship. But I think it's kind of neat to be able to say that our church is a sending church. Our church is a group of people that says we want to send out missionaries and those that do more things around. Number 11, all the volunteers in the church. How many people have volunteered to do things in our church, right? Can you stand up if you've served in our church somehow, some way, in any capacity at all? And if you're still sitting down, that might be a sign to you that you could probably serve the next round. Thank you. You can be seated. But we've had people that have served with Panera Bread and with coffee and with cleaning up and with ushering and greeting and with serving with kids and helping with communion. And this whole church is about the volunteers. It's about you that work and serve together. It's not about me, the pastor with a microphone. It's the fact that all of us come together as a community. This year, we're commissioning more people to be on a prayer team, to people who serve in prayer. One thing I'd like to do in this church is, during a sermon or with worship, is open the floor space so that God can work in your life. Michelle and I have been talking about a prayer ministry where if you're in need, if you hear from God, if you have a desire, a need to be met, you can come forward and just pray during the service. God's Spirit is open to work in here. We're not such a manufactured church that everything has to be so cut and dry and nuts and bolts in our certain way of doing things. If God's Spirit wants to move, we need to get out of the way and let God's Spirit move. And if prayer needs to happen and we need to just stop talking or we need to listen to God, whatever, I just want to be the kind of a church where we listen to God's Spirit move among us. In fact, let's end with that. Let's talk about number 12, God's faithful work. I think if I were to stack a stack of rocks, it would be a lot about the things that we've seen happen, the stuff that God has done among us and within us and around us and through us with the people. I mean, how many people have been in hospital and have healed? How many people are still in a need in hospital? How many hurt marriages are there? How many people? We need each other, right? We're this community group that love and need and respect one another. But I'm just going to talk about God's faithful work for a minute. There are two kinds of theology when it comes to communion. There is what's called sacramental theology, where this is a sacrament that we participate in. And there is ordinance theology. Can you say those two words under your breath? Sacramental and ordinance. Well, let me talk about them. Neither one is right or wrong. Neither one is good or bad. Neither one is better or worse. It is just the way that we perceive God's work. We, in the covenant denomination, happen to be a sacramental theological view of the elements of communion and of baptism. Sacramental means that God has done this work previous to us, and we just simply participate in the work of God. Jesus died on the cross how many years ago? Right? Any of us there? Has God's work still done that before us, right? God worked before we were even aware. And in our lives, when we take communion, or receive, really, that's a better word, and when we receive baptism, it's because God has done his work and we just participate in the flow of the stream. You get it? Ordinance theology is like obedience. It's this idea that, well, because God did this, I'm going to obey. And a lot of my faith is based on my obedience. Now, that's also true. It happens to be a true theological thing. But a little hitch, if you will, is that we tend to get our obedience out in front of God. We tend to think, well, if I do these good things, then God will be more happy. That happens to be a misnomer in the church. People tend to think, well, I'm working harder, therefore God should bless me. And that's, for me, not very clear. I think for me, I'd rather be a sacramental view of God's already faithful work. God has already set the table. He has already, if you will, stopped up the river so we can cross over. We do have to have faith to walk through, but God has already done this work. So when we come to table, when we think about communion, we think about the fact that God has already given us his son, has already given us this sacrifice so that we celebrate him. I grew up a Baptist kid. And nothing against Baptists, but the idea was you sit there long enough and you think about your sin. You think about how bad of a person you are. And when you start to feeling bad enough, then you can thank God that he's saved you, and then you can come and receive a piece of bread. And I was like, okay, I guess that's the way it feels. I don't know, some of you might have been raised like that too. Like you sit there and you need to read Isaiah, and you need to read how Jesus was punished for our sin. It was a very pay the debt kind of thing. And if you grew up like that, that's okay. But I got into the covenant denomination, and I remember in seminary, we would sit in chapel, and then we'd come forward to take communion. And the pastor or the minister would say, all right, we come to the table as these gifts of God for his people. And all these other students would jump up and run to the table. And I'm sitting back going, wait, why aren't you thinking about how bad you feel? And they're like, I don't have time for that. God already saved me. I don't feel bad anymore. And it changed the way I think about the fact that we come to elements because God has already done this work. I started to realize I don't have to feel bad about my sin. Not because I don't sin, but because God has already totally covered. And it'd be like you coming home from a party summer and you've been off and gallivanting, doing your own summer, and you come home to your family, and do you want your dad to stand there and look at you with his arms crossed and like, where have you been all summer? Or do you want your dad to say, oh my gosh, you're home, and just love you and embrace you, right? And so that's this feeling I have. When we come to the table, it's this sacramental view of, oh, God has welcomed us to him. There is no wrong before God. God doesn't put any barriers in front of the table. You come and God forgives our sin. Where do we go from here? How do we move forward? I want you to know that it's good to look back into the past. For example, my wife and I just celebrated 25 years of marriage. Isn't that cool? And I used to be skinny back then. My wife has always been beautiful, so there's no change. But I think anniversaries are good for looking back. It's like looking in the side mirror of your car. I think it's important to look backwards sometimes, right? But the truth is, we don't live in the past. Many people live in their past, for good or for bad. I had the best childhood, or my dad did this for me, or I was abused as a kid and I can't get through it. We live in the past. You know that God doesn't say live in the past. He says, set up a stack of rocks, remember what I did for you, but don't live there. And I want us to know that as a body of believers, we don't live in our 10-year past. We live walking forward to see what God's about to do, right? So let me finish with these 3 questions I need you to pose in your own life. 3 simple things that you need to consider every time you look at a stack of rocks, every time you think of where we are as a church, every time you consider whether you want to keep attending this church or whether you're going to go to some other church. You need to think of 3 things. Who is God in my life? Who am I? And 3, how do I align myself with what God is already doing? Now, God could call you out of this church to go on a mission or to go somewhere else or start another church. Or, maybe in our next 10 years, we start planting churches in other towns so that they can have God's presence. They feel God in other places. I'd love to be a church planting church. Maybe we send out more missionaries and people that go on mission to do various things, and in the name of God and in this church, they're serving around the world. But I think we need to start to understand who God really is and who am I and how do I align myself with that. That's where I think the future should go. Hey, can I get real for a second? Did you know that in Joshua chapter 3, God did not stop up the river until the priests stepped into the water? Did you know that? If you want to research something today, go read Joshua 3, because God had the river flowing at flood stage, and he was waiting for the priests to have faith enough to take a step in the water. Question for you this morning: do you have faith enough to take a step with God? Michelle is up here to pray again for anybody who would like maybe a little bit more faith, or wants to bring something in faith to God, or actually has a need in faith. Would you like prayer this morning? We'd like to invite you to come forward. We'd ask you to come down and receive prayer for anything you want. God may be working in your life, and all you see is this huge flowing river at flood stage, and you cannot see a way to cross the river. Is that your life today? Do you feel like, there ain't no way I'm going over there? I don't have the money. I don't have the time. I don't feel healthy. I don't want to get there without God doing something. And God's like, well, take a step. What's your step this morning? Can you come forward and receive prayer, Michelle? So God gave me a word just now to send you off with. Normally we do the blessing like this, right? Hands open wide. Remember that silly childhood game? Rock, paper, scissors? There's a way you can carry your rock of remembrance with you everywhere. Let's make a rock with our fist and put it in your hand. God, we remember your faithfulness today. We trust you with the rock that you have done a miracle in our life, and we ask you, God, to bless in the future. We receive the blessing this morning. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious unto you. May the Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace both now and forevermore. Amen? Amen. Will you